Welcome to all participants and panelists for this seminar on healthy wetlands and resilient cities, and why cities need wetlands to survive. This is part of the third talk in the Nature Matters series being organized by WWF India. And WWF India is celebrating its 50th year of working towards the cause of nature conservation this year in 2020. So congratulations to WWF India and more power to your folks as you go along on this relentless work and this tough path. So events this year have brought into sharp focus the link between human health and the health of our ecosystem. The pandemic with COVID-19, the science that links the loss of forest and wildlife to the emergence of pandemics has never been clearer. I mean, we are seeing it real time in our lives. While we continue to grapple with controlling the current pandemic, it also gives us an unparalleled opportunity to put in place policies and take action to halt and reverse the loss of nature that would help prevent future pandemics, right? So everybody is sure that this is perhaps the beginning of a set of pandemics if we continue the way we are continuing with the destruction of habitats. So it is in this backdrop that the WWF India webinar series, Nature Matters, is to present, explore, and discuss the future of conservation in India. And this is the third in a series of 10 interactive discussions which will happen. And this session is called Healthy Wetlands, Resilient Cities. I just have to also introduce to you why urban wetlands are getting to be important to cities. No? Urban wetlands, lakes, ponds, and other water bodies are critical for maintaining the water balance of a city, for flood cushioning, for microclimate regulation, and for protecting biodiversity. And perhaps this is the most important, for protecting biodiversity. However, apparently these services are underappreciated by our urban planners, decision makers, and even by city residents. And generally, urban planning and urban growth has ignored wetlands and their catchments, especially the catchments, not only to mention the wetlands itself. This, coupled with changes in drainage, hydrology, loss of catchments, pollution, and climate change, has resulted in the loss of wetlands in most cities across India. The Global Wetland Outlook found that the loss of wetlands globally is 3 times faster than the loss of forests. And the world has lost 37% of wetlands in the last 4 decades. And the scenario is the same in India, perhaps more so in India. The Niti Aayog in its recent report had predicted that 21 major cities across India, including Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Gurgaon, and Hyderabad, are likely to run out of groundwater by this year, by 2020 itself. And on the other hand, you've seen that in Chennai, Mumbai, Srinagar, Bangalore, and now Gurgaon and Delhi, urban flooding are on the rise and causing huge problems in terms of economic productivity as well as destruction to life and property. We saw that in the Sahibi Jheel area. I mean, the whole lake, which emerged due to the floods and because it was not protected. One of the main reasons for this sorry state of affairs is the absence of a strong institutional mechanism for management of urban wetlands. Although some states have notified wetland authorities, most of these lack both capacity and resources. Further, through the National Program on Conservation of Aquatic Ecosystems, which suggests adopting an integrated approach, many of the on-ground programs on revival of lakes in the country do not take a comprehensive approach. I see that in my city of Bangalore, where the water body itself is focused upon, but the catchment and the linkages to the catchment, the nutrient flows in the ecosystem, wastewater flowing, solid waste, construction debris, is difficult to manage for the authority which is developing or managing the lake or wetland. However, there is ground for hope as government officials, experts, and citizens, especially citizens across India, who have been coming forward to address further degradation of urban water bodies. Such groups are active almost in every city in India and even in the small and medium towns. However, many of these initiatives need stronger integration with planning and with governance and with management, because this will enable cities to become living cities where life is livable. So we have an exciting panel. We have a very interesting panel, which will discuss how to build climate and water resilient cities around wetlands, perspectives on wetland-centered and wetland-integrated urban planning, infrastructure, siting, moving towards embedding zero loss in wetland areas within cities, and the concept of sponge cities, which is now emerging. That will perhaps be discussed as part of the presentation. It's a wonderful panel. We have academics, we have administrators, we have researchers, we have communicators. And that's an interesting mix to have, and I look forward to the panel discussions. Let me quickly introduce the panel. First, we have Ms. Manju Pandey. She's an Indian civil servant, currently the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Ms. Pandey is also the Government of India CPA focal point for Ramsar Convention. And during her tenure with the Wetlands Division MOEF, Ms. Pandey has led the development of the National Program for Conservation of Aquatic Ecosystems. And she's played a key role in rolling out the 100-day wetland program and now the 1,000 wetlands program aimed towards restoring and conserving wetlands across the country. We're lucky to have you here. Welcome, Ms. Manju Pandey. Dr. Matthew Simpson, who will be making the keynote address, has over 20 years experience in delivering wetland conservation, research, assessment, design, and management related projects. He is currently the president of the Society of Wetland Scientists, Europe chapter, and a member of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands Scientific and Technical Reviews panel and Wetland City Accreditation Independent Advisory Committee. He is the co-author of the Guidebook on Integrated Urban Development and Wetlands, published by the Ramsar Convention, which will form the basis of his presentation today. Dr. Matthew is currently the director of 35% Limited, an environmental consultancy specializing in wetlands, and has managed wetland projects in Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, and North America. Welcome, Dr. Matthew, to this webinar. Professor K.T. Ravindran, in most planning and architecture and urban design circles, needs no introduction, is one of the leading voices in the country on urban design. As a former head of urban design and dean at School of Planning and Architecture at Delhi, his work focuses on the development of cities and more specifically on the inclusion and conservation of heritage buildings in modern urban spaces. Founder and president of the Institute of Urban Designers, he teaches urban morphology and humanizing cities. He's also significantly involved in public decision-making sphere. He was the chair Delhi Urban Arts Commission and one of the 5 members of the advisory board drawn from around the world on the UN project in New York City. Welcome, Professor K.T. Ravindran. Mr. Karigowda is an IAS officer. I had the pleasure of having him at my house last year, and he's now made a 30,000 liter rainwater harvesting tank, which is thanks to the monsoon full. So that's a personal connect with Mr. Karigowda. He's currently serving as the director of the Department of Agriculture Marketing, Government of Karnataka. During his tenure as the Deputy Commissioner and District Magistrate of Bangalore Rural District, which adjoins the Bangalore city, he has led a multi-stakeholder initiative to rejuvenate around 30 wetlands, including a cascade of peri-urban wetlands in the industrial area of Bashettihalli. So that's a very rich experience of how a growing city and a growing industrial movement starts to impact wetlands and what needs to be done to restore them, bring them back to life. Welcome, Mr. Karigowda, to the webinar. And finally, last but not the least, Ms. Neha Sinha, conservation biologist and policy and advocacy officer, Bombay Natural History Society. Neha specialized in important bird areas program and conservation policies. You often see her writing a lot about wetlands with a lot of passion, and one can read it in almost every journal that is of repute in India. She has served as guest faculty at Delhi University. She teaches political ecology. She has also served as a member of the Central Zoo Authority's Expert Committee on Research and Publications. Neha writes for the Hindustan Times, Bloomberg Quint, Economic Political Weekly, and you name it. I have been reading her work on wetlands even in the Hindu as recently as 1 hour back. So it's very productive and very profound writings. She's also a member of the IUCN Commission on Education and Communication. She's consulting editor for The Wire and Sanctuary Asia. Welcome, Neha Sinha, to the webinar. So the way the webinar will go from now on is that there will be a keynote presentation by Dr. Matthew Simpson for about 15 minutes, and then there will be one round of discussion with all the panelists. I'd like to remind the audience that if you have questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A section, not in the chat section. Please post them in the Q&A section. And we have time for question and answers at the end of the panel discussion. We'll make sure that we'll include as many questions as is possible. And those that are not answered, we'll make sure that it gets a reply later on. So note the Q&A section, which is in the below panel, is where you post your questions. In chat, you can have your conversations with everybody else. So I would love to give the floor to Dr. Matthew on this, Dr. Matthew Simpson. The floor or the panel or the screen is all yours now for the next 15 minutes.
That's very kind, and thank you very much to WWF India for inviting me to present today. And I'm very honoured to be part of such a distinguished panel that we've just heard about. So thank you very much. Right, I will share my screen and hopefully it will work. and we should begin the presentation.
Yes, and if you can make it full screen, Dr. Matthew, that would be perfect. There it is.
Is that okay?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, as was mentioned, I worked with a number of different organizations, particularly the Chinese government and the Ramsar Convention, to develop this good practices handbook for integrating urban development and wetland conservation. And this was done with from a series of workshops with planners, policymakers and developers, as well as conservation organisations. And I'll talk through some of the findings from that workshop and the publication itself now. As we've kind of already heard, there's a huge expansion of urban areas across the world, and now over half of us live within urban areas, and it's set to rise to about 2.5 billion people living in urban areas by 2050. And interesting to the audience today, 35% of that growth will be in India, China and Nigeria. And it's expected that about 416 additional million urban dwellers will be in India by 2050. So with this huge increase in urbanization, obviously there's going to be an increase in the challenges for sustainable urban areas, sustainable development, and we'll talk about that with the panel later. So at the same time as there's been this urban expansion, there's also been a massive loss of wetlands. And since 1700, we think about 87% have been lost, and that's accelerated since the 1970s with maybe 35, even 40% loss, some people are now predicting. And that's had a corresponding impact on biodiversity with about 83% decline in freshwater species since 1970. So whilst urban areas have been increasing, there's been a big loss of wetland areas. And the wetland areas within our urban areas are more and more threatened. And these tend to be from drain to create space for housing and other developments. There's been loss of biodiversity because there's been conversion of wetland areas to maybe public parks and recreational lakes. Like in this photo here, there's been increased wastewater pollution and solid waste pollution into the wetland areas. There's been an increase of impervious or impermeable areas, so hard surfaces, and the use of hard infrastructure rather than green infrastructure in cities. Rivers and streams have often been thought of as a problem, so they've been put into a straightened channel or even buried underground in many situations. And this has meant that there's been a disconnection, the rivers and the streams from the wetlands themselves. So the wetlands dry out, and then that's another excuse to fill them in and build on them. And in many of our urban areas around the world, invasive species have been a real problem, and there's been a general loss in native biodiversity. And why is this happening? Well, often because urban wetlands are undervalued in terms of the ecosystem services they provide, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They're not often or haven't traditionally been used as part of urban planning decisions. They're just seen as areas where you can build on and not protect. And we found with many places where we've worked, not one agency responsible for wetlands, and which leads to poor governance because it's multi-agencies and it's not protected within the government and within the planning system of a country. So when we're talking about urban wetlands, there's two types. One where existing wetlands, most of our civilizations have grown up being near wetlands because there's access to water, access to fertile land. So some of the greatest cities in the world have been developed alongside wetlands. And as the cities grow, they tend to build out across these wetland areas. And so within our cities, there are existing wetlands, but also there's a new wetlands that are built, constructed wetlands. Now, these can be as part of new developments, alongside housing or flats, or they can be retrofitted into old developments. And these have been developed to create green spaces. This is the photograph of the London Wetland Centre in London, which is a completely created wetland in the heart of London that was made for recreation, leisure and education. But also they have other roles, such as rain gardens or stormwater wetlands to store rainwater as it falls, or constructed wetlands even for water treatment. And these new urban wetlands are being designed to deliver multiple benefits. So thinking of the benefits of urban wetlands, water supply is one, flood regulation is another very important one, moderating the climate, so reducing air temperatures or keeping areas warm, treating wastewater, providing habitat for biodiversity. In many urban areas around the world, they're still used for agriculture and aquaculture, even within the centre of cities. They're used for tourism, recreation, leisure and education. They can have very important roles in terms of culture and heritage. And they are used frequently for recreation, and that has been shown to improve human well-being. There's been many studies more recently that have shown if you live within a kilometre of a green space, then the incidences of things such as depression, heart disease are lower. So they're very important for maintaining the health of residents within a city. So what are the drivers behind integrating urban planning and wetland conservation and planning together? So some more recent developments. So in 2012, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands passed a resolution which urged signatories of the convention, and that's about, I think now 172 countries around the world have signed up to the Ramsar Convention to protect wetlands. And they adopted this wise use of wetlands within urban and peri-urban areas. It was instrumental in changing how many countries viewed wetlands within their urban areas. And also this more integrated approach to urban planning. So thinking about densification and agglomeration so that you're having people maybe in high rises so that you can have more green space around them. And this is all an idea to reduce per capita resource use. And then there's been a number of international and national city initiatives and accreditations. So the Ramsar Convention has produced a Wetland City accreditation to particularly focus on urban areas. And in China, for example, sponge cities are a way of managing stormwater within a city, and I'll talk in more detail about that a little later. And then others such as city and biodiversity and garden cities, which are all trying to promote better use of water resources and green space within cities. And there's been more of a recognition of the important role that small and micro wetlands play, particularly when it comes to stormwater management, and the role generally, as I've said, about other ecosystem services. But I guess, yeah, this big driver has been on maintaining human well-being through managing the ecosystem services that wetlands provide, whether that's cleaning water or whether it's reducing storm damage. Those are all important drivers. So the handbook that was developed really was trying to focus on best practice for a range of different periods through the planning through to construction of wetlands or developments within a city. So some of the key lessons that came out from examples from around the world that came to talk at the workshops or that were contacted afterwards were for best practice. You really came from China. One of the key lessons was to set environmental objectives and targets as well as regulations that back those up. And to really think about adapting the development that you're going to do to the existing environment. So not destroying a water body that's there, but incorporating housing within the wetlands. Really, one of the big examples from the United States that came was showing that changing your attitude to protecting against floods and stormwater storage and thinking that wetlands can play a role in that. I mean, that's a real change, I think, in many states in the United States now in terms of how they manage wetlands. Really taking into account ecological functioning within designs. That's a new development in China, and using native species rather than non-native species to make sure that you're protecting biodiversity. Ensuring that designs are in tune with the project objectives and have clear objectives on things such as wildlife and culture, for example, and really understanding that the community has to be part of the management of these wetlands. People living near them have to be part of it, and making sure that you use multidisciplinary teams so that you have a real understanding of what's required in design. And then when it comes to sort of the design and construction side, a big focus coming out of one of the projects in Australia, one of the cities, was sustainability, and really thinking about low carbon, energy neutrality, those type of aspects of a design, and making sure that wetlands are part of that. As I said before, China has been trying now to really think about native local species rather than bringing in different species from around the world. Maximizing biodiversity. Now, you do this through understanding how habitats work, how hydrology works, how soils work, how they interact with biodiversity, and making sure you're creating the right environment for biodiversity to thrive. Think about multifunctioning within wetlands and therefore the multiple benefits that you're going to have. Restoring and rehabilitating degraded urban sites. So maybe not thinking about destroying new wetland, existing wetland areas, but going back to urban sites which are being regenerated. Really establishing a good communication program and public awareness program with the community. In Sri Lanka, definitely developing bespoke and local solutions in different areas across cities rather than thinking that one solution will work in every context. And yeah, I think with all the examples, they were trying to follow the Ramsar wise use principles, so the wise use of wetlands. So I'll quickly go on to some case studies of two cities, and both of these became wetland cities when in 2018, when Ramsar initiated this wetland city accreditation program. And with wetland city requirements, what a city is asked to do is have policies and regulations in place to protect urban wetlands. It has to implement wetland restoration and management measures across a city. It has to have integrated wetlands into spatial planning and city management. It has to have an active connection with local community and involve them in wetland planning and management. It has to have a wetland public awareness campaigns, particularly celebrating World Wetlands Day, which is on the 2nd of February each year. It has to have robust water quality and waste management standards and approaches, and really integrating all those multiple ecosystem service benefits into planning. So it's asking quite a lot of a city, but the cities that we'll talk about in a minute did this in a very comprehensive way and managed to achieve Wetland City accreditation. And then Sponge Cities, another initiative which I mentioned earlier, is really an integrated urban water management strategy. And the idea is that you use grey and green infrastructure in an organised way to soak up rainwater, stormwater. And 30 cities across China initially were part of these city pilots. And the idea was to increase the area of urban land up to a minimum of 20% to absorb surface water. And the idea is that these areas retained or reused at least 70% of that urban stormwater. And they had to achieve this by 2020. and by 2030 achieve 80% storage and retention of this water. And linked to that, there was updates in official guidance in terms of designing urban green space, and also road engineering to make sure that they included this storage of stormwater and rainwater. So if I start with Changshu, which is a sponge city, and it is also a wetland city now, this is an amazing comprehensive approach to how you can integrate wetlands across a whole city and integrate better, improved management. Shanghu Lake, which is in the center of Changshu, in the 1960s, they drained this lake and they converted it to agriculture, and they started building on it. And as a result, water quality became very poor across the city. The agricultural yields were very poor. The forest around the city started to fail, and people noticed that the local climate had changed. So they needed a comprehensive plan to change this. And so they started this integration of wetland management across the whole city. And even the rural and peri-urban areas outside became part of this plan. So you had village and local wetlands treating water on the periphery, and then you had wetlands within the city treating and storing water. And really, it's an incredible story, because the urban master plan of Changshu in 2010 really, once that was implemented, has radically changed the water quality across the whole city, and it is a much more livable place now. In 2015, they were thinking more about flood damage and controlling flooding, and so they started doing a comprehensive plan to see how rainwater was routed through the city, and making sure that were wetlands at key locations to make sure that that stored that rainwater so that it didn't get passed downstream for further flooding. And one of the amazing elements is that they've restored all these wetlands across the city and now turned them into wetland parks. So it's a massive tourist destination now as a result, where people come and enjoy these wetland areas. And they also set up a comprehensive kind of monitoring and evaluation system so they could measure the success. And one key area was also making sure that local stakeholder groups were part of that, and they were contributing to the management of the wetland areas. So a huge success story in Changshu, as with a number of other cities in China, and which is now leading to a radical change in urban planning across the whole of China. And then we come to Colombo, a bit closer to where many of you are, in Sri Lanka. And there's massive wetlands areas across the whole of Colombo. But these were being lost. So 40% of those wetlands were lost since the 1980s, and maybe 58 acres a year were being lost. And this is largely from infilling and encroachment into the wetland areas. But there are also big problems in terms of wastewater pollution and solid waste getting into those wetland areas and into the rivers and channels across the city. So work started being done around about 2013 to look in more detail about these wetland areas. And this was largely as a result of flooding being such a problem across the city. And it was soon recognized that these wetland areas were absolutely crucial in stopping flooding. And the work that's been done has shown that without the wetlands within the city, there would be a catastrophic flood, the same sort of size as the 2010 flood, happening every year or happening every other year if those wetlands weren't protected across the city. And as you can see, I won't read out the figures because I don't have time, but as you can see, they're making a huge economic contribution to the city, these different ecosystem services. The wetlands lower the temperature of the city by about 10 degrees compared to hard surfaces. And this ability covers about 50% of urban Colombo. So you can see that in terms of electricity use for air conditioning, it's greatly reduced because the wetlands are playing this important role in cooling the city. And the wetlands improve water quality because they're treating wastewater. and also they improve air quality because they're taking in particulate matter particularly from things such as transport. And more recently, like Changshu in China, there's been more focus on turning these wetland areas into recreational areas. So opening them up as parks, having jogging tracks through them, other recreational activities, which now is playing an important role in terms of the economy within Colombo. And what's astonishing about the wetlands in Colombo is it has very high biodiversity, and even species such as the endangered fishing cat has a healthy population within the city. So the kind of recognition that there is an important role in terms of ecosystem services for people has been great, but also the protection of biodiversity has been absolutely crucial in the city. So in 2016, the government, the World Bank and others developed a wetland management strategy, and I haven't got time to talk about this in detail, unfortunately, but there were kind of 5 principles. 1, to recognise the benefits of wetlands. 2, to prevent any further loss. 3, to restore wetlands and the degraded wetlands where that was possible. Engage as much as possible with the local community and put in improved governance across the city. And I'm really pleased to say that in 2018, there was a cabinet moratorium on wetlands within Colombo, which stopped the future destruction of the wetlands because they are so important, particularly for flood events in the city. And as I say, Colombo was the first capital city in the world to achieve Ramsar Wetland City status in 2018 as well, which was fantastic. Now, there are a whole series of recommendations that were given in the handbook, which you can read online on the Ramsar website. And these were for policymakers, and particularly to set up better governance and wetland protection. I'm not going to read all of these now, but the key thing for policymakers and planners is really to increase the understanding of wetlands, make sure that they're included within regulation and planning, and that there's a real holistic approach thought about how wetlands can contribute to having much healthier cities. But I think I'll stop there now because I'm probably getting over my time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to take questions and discuss items with the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Matthewson. That was very comprehensive and very nicely done. In a brief time, you have to convey so much, and it's been beautifully done. And thanks for those 2 case studies also, as well as the recommendations. I'm sure that everybody will have a chance to go through this presentation at some point of time and learn from the slides that you've put up and sort of mull over it and be able to take the benefit of the framing that you've put in place. So let me just jump to the other panelists now, following your talk. And I'll just start by asking Ms. Manju Pandey, how do you see Indian urban wetlands now that you've been there and you've been observing how urban wetlands are performing in the Indian context? And how do you think that the state wetland authorities are doing it? What are the lessons that can be learned from what they've been doing? Ms. Manju Pandey.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely presentation also. I mean, it kind of reinforced why we need wetlands in today's world. And the question to me is about the state wetland authorities. Okay, so as the ministry, you know, one of our big roles is a regulatory role. So in that regulatory role, the 2010 Wetland Conservation and Management Rules were kind of amended in 2017. And the major change which happened in the 2017 rules was that state wetland authorities were created, because water in India is a state subject. It's a federal structure. Since it is a state subject, you know, most of the things, even if you tell from here, it basically depends on the state whether they will implement it or not. Keeping that in view, in the new rules, state wetland authorities have been constituted. One major thing which has been done in the constitution of the state wetland authorities is, it is not only the wetland division, the constitution and the rule itself, and make it, you know, kind of a cross-sectoral so that each division is involved in it. It has members from urban development. It has members from irrigation, like the Secretary Irrigation is a member, Secretary Fisheries, Environment, Forest, Tourism, Agriculture. Each department is a member of this State Wetland Committee, basically to see that there is cross-sectoral coordination. And everywhere it is headed either by the Chief Secretary or the Chief Minister, so that everybody takes a decision in a coordinated way. So these wetland authorities were made, the rules came out in 2017, and it has taken some time for all the states to kind of fall in line and see to it that they start functioning properly. For the initial 1 year, 2018, there were a lot of problems because rules interpretation was a problem. So there were a lot of questions which were coming our way, and to solve them, we have come up with the guidelines for the wetland rules, where clearly, what all problems people had, the states had, we have tried to simplify it and tell them how to go about it. This year, when we have taken a thing as to where all it has been said, most of the states have already constituted their state wetland authorities. Now, even the functioning, the state wetland authorities are supposed to meet frequently. In some states, we have realized they have started functioning beautifully and they have started taking very good decisions. States like UP and Bihar, which normally, are part of the Bimaru states, we say, they are doing exceptionally well as far as the state wetland authority is concerned. They've been having regular meetings and major decisions like putting wetlands in the revenue records as wetlands and not wastelands has been taken by the UP State Wetland Authority, and they have started work on that. They have already finished the work of putting wetlands in the land records. Same decision has been taken by Bihar also now. So it's kind of, if Bihar and UP can do it, I'm sure the other states can also follow. So we keep on getting information. Manipur is having regular meetings. They keep on sending us, our state wetland authority has decided on this. Punjab is doing very well. And we have a lot of other states. Kerala is doing very well. They have regular meetings on state wetland authorities. Andhra has started working. So last year I was a bit feeling, that it's not really taken up. This year, I'm happy that the state wetland authorities are taking shape, and they have kind of realized, I'm not saying it's the best case scenario, but yes, work has started. So that is one reply, the reply to your state wetland authorities. Right. And besides that, you, in your initial address, you were talking about the NPCA program, probably the funding program which the Government of India runs. Now, that's a program which has been going on for very long, wherein, we help states. It's partial funding, like we give 60-70%. The rest the state has to bear, basically for restoration and rejuvenation of wetlands. There also, in the last year, we have made a major change. Like I heard you saying that, it was not an integrated plan which was coming. So many times, we would get annually, wetlands would ask us for money every year for this. Now we are insisting that we will give money only to those wetlands which come up with a proper integrated management plan.
Right.
Last year, just to share with you, we had a pilot project. We worked on the 100 wetland. This was wetland rejuvenation. As you know, Ministry of Jal Shakti has come up. So since last 1 year, India is also giving a lot of importance to restoration and rejuvenation of wetlands. So amongst the 169 transformative ideas of Government of India, wetlands rejuvenation was one of them. So last year, from August to December, we worked on a 130 wetlands project, wherein we had identified some wetlands, and we started off with a 4-pronged strategy, wherein the first part was coming up with brief documents for all these wetlands. Brief documents are basically, you'll have baseline data about that wetland, the lat long, what are the threats, the details about the wetland. We got those made for all these 130 wetlands. A new concept was introduced last year, wherein we worked on the wetland health cards. Now this health card, actually could be a very detailed health card, but we had simplified it because we wanted all the nodal officers, to put them on board and get it made. So basically 4-5 parameters. Biodiversity was one of them, but choking of wetlands, how many inlets are there, how many choked, how many outlands are there, how many choked, what is the area encroached, what is the BOD, COD of the water quality. Those parameters were taken and we gave, if this is there, this many marks, and we came out with a number for each wetland. There was a wetland score, health score for each wetland. And then we categorize them from A to D, DE. So A wetlands, basically doing well. Those are mostly the Himalayan wetlands in Gujarat. Doing very well, we basically just need to monitor them. Gradually coming to out of 130, there were about 32 wetlands, which we found were red, which had a lot of threats, which came out in the brief document. The health was very bad and they needed immediate attention. So all this information was shared with the states, and to those 32 wetlands, we had asked them to come up with integrated management plan. The framework plan, we told them, we have now told them to come up with detailed management plans, which should have in their plan what was the threat which had been identified, what is the problem with the health, what is the remedy which they are proposing in the management plan, and it has to be a focused management plan, and then only we are giving funds for restoration of those plans. So after I thought it was a good thing because we got to know actually what is happening. We have now started with the phase 2 and we have identified about 1,000 wetlands now. Unfortunately, it got delayed. We were supposed to start in February, but because of the lockdown. And last year, we worked with all the nodal officers, the wetland managers. We worked with them and they came up with everything. This year, we are not able to go hold workshops. Last year, we used to go to their place, handle them. This year, we are having everything through VC, like we are having this meeting now. So we have taken a lot of help from the knowledge partners. WWF is one of them, Wetlands International, SECON, CWRDM, all of them are helping us in this process. And hopefully by December end, we'll have something, to show and tell.
Yeah.
I don't know whether should I continue or we can go to the other panelists and we'll keep discussing.
Yes, we'll come back, Manju. But thank you for that comprehensive outlook that you've already provided on Indian urban wetlands, and hopefully in a couple of years, Dr. Matthew Simpson will have some case studies from India being highlighted in his presentation.
Yes, certainly. We're working on them.
Yeah, we'll look at that. Professor K.T. Ravindran, I'll come to you. There was quite an upbeat note. Are you so optimistic, and what do you see as challenges, Professor K.T.? You'll have to unmute yourself, Professor K.T. Ravindran.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Well, I'm not that optimistic as yet, mainly for two reasons. First one is that from the past records that we have of any central legislation towards environment has been diluted at state level. That's been a standard scene that we have had in the case of the Coastal Zone Regulation or even the EIA committee, functioning of the EIA committee. So basically the subject of development and planning, which is the area I'd like to speak on, are by constitution, they are with the state. So these lands and the waters that come into wetland areas, they are part of the state, under the state legislation. And as rightly pointed out by Manjuji just now, many states have come forward, which is a good thing. But to what extent will this interface with the planning process is a major gap that we need to still address. That is my place of non-optimism. I wouldn't call it pessimism, non-optimism.
Right.
Yeah? So, because there are two ways in which the wetland is threatened. One is by climate change, by the rise of seawater, and many of the wetland areas are in low-lying areas, wetland, at least along the coastal areas, and large number of them are in the coastal areas, and very large number of them are along the Gangetic Plain. So when Ms. Manju ji said that UP and Bihar have done very well because they are both lying on the Gangetic Plain, the Gangetic Plain, and Gangetic Plain has the maximum number of wetland sites. So anything that they do is very crucial, and that's a good sign that these two states are actually active. But along the Bay of Bengal, you have a large number of wetlands, coastal wetlands, and there the story is very different. Right. And even in places like Kerala and Gujarat has the highest number of wetlands, and many of them inland along water bodies, and some of them along the coast. The coastal ones have an attack of rising water level and so on from the sea, climate change issues, which we can do precious little about now, because the climate change is already rolling. What we can do is to mitigate its impact on human lives and property. That's what we can do. So that, how do you say this? How do you actually protect the wetland from the climate change issues is number one issue. Number two issue from where they are attacked from the other side is the indiscriminate growth of urban development. Right. We have a number of such examples in India where large number of wetlands have already been lost. The worst example you can quote is that of Calcutta. Yeah. Where the entire new city of Calcutta, Rajarghat, was planned on the wetlands. Right. It's, in fact, perhaps at one time, maybe the entire city of Calcutta was a wetland, which the British slowly reclaimed and built canals and so on to keep waters dry. But still the city, entire city and the land thereof lies below the water level of the Hooghly River. And towards the east, we have this huge amount of wetlands, which go and then merge with the, sorry?
With the Ganges, I think.
With the Ganges. No, they merge with the Ganges and they go into the, as an estuary, they flow back into the sea. And that is the area where you have a very huge amount of mangrove forests.
Right.
Yeah? So the distinction between a mangrove forest area and a wetland areas is something that we still need to define, because mangrove forests are protected under the Environmental Act, that is Coastal Regulation Act, Coastal Zone Regulation Act. It's Coastal Zone 1, and it's completely protected as far as that the rules are concerned. Whether it's protected in reality or not is a different question, because that's always a problem of rules in India. We know that in Maharashtra, they've been largely violated, and now they are paying the price of that by excessive flooding and so on. So if these two things are not brought together, then these two problems are thought of together. If we don't think of them together, we are going to be in some very deep trouble, both in terms of the health of the wetlands, as well as with the health of the settlement. Yeah. It was very nicely pointed out how Chinese cities have actually practiced rehabilitation and rejuvenation of the health of the wetlands, and how it has improved the water quality, and how it has improved tourism, and how it's improved an entire, kind of old cities have been revved up. The economy, environment, everything was revved up. Yeah. And China is doing it in landscape. Now, we haven't not even started doing this.
Right. Thank you, Professor K.T. Ravindran. I mean, there's a whole debate on the environmental Kuznets curve, but I'm sure WWF will do a separate webinar on the environmental Kuznets curve, and we'll talk about it in terms of the growth of the economy, and then the attention paid to environmental areas and zones. But I'll just bring in Mr. Karigowda. Mr. Karigowda has had the opportunity of being an IS officer, running the restoration of 30 wetlands in the peri-urban area, which is also an industrial area. So, Mr. Karigowda, would you like to share your experience, and what kind of lessons do you think that you have drawn from it, which you can share with our audience and other panelists?
Yes, sir. Thank you for giving an opportunity to speak. It was a nice presentation by Matthew Simpson. Yes, sir. I had an opportunity to serve as a DC Bangalore Rural District for 1 year. During my tenure as a DC there, with the help of public, Industries Association and NGO, especially the WWF, we were successful in desilting some 30 lakes, 5 Kalyanis. In Dodbalapura town, there are some 12 Kalyana Mantapas and 3 cinema halls. All have adopted rainwater harvesting. If you go and see in Vascote town, all private hospitals, they have rainwater harvesting facility. It was a good experience. What I felt, the lesson learned is, if you create an awareness among the public, the need for water conservation and wetland conservation, if you involve the people, the various stakeholders, and if there is transparency in what you do in execution, let's say identify the role and distribution of work, we can achieve desired result. Even Vishwanath sir has mentioned one lake, what we did in Dodbalapura town adjacent to industrial area. More than that, I have one more good experience to share with all the panelists here. There is one lake in Koira. It's around 20 acres of area. Koira is very famous because the Vidhana Saudha of in Bangalore was built by the stones from Koira. It's very famous for granite stone. We have desilted. When I started desilting of that lake, the local villagers, they contributed around 3.8 lakhs. So money was not enough. So when we went and requested Rotary International, they invested some 80 lakhs and desilted that lake. Now, this year they have transplanted paddy. This is after 5 years they have transplanted planting in that village. Inspired by the success of that lake and happiness of the local villagers, Rotary International, they have decided to take up 10,000 desilting and rejuvenation of lakes across India. That's a good thing what has happened.
Right.
One more in Nelmangla Taluk, one for a private seed company, they sponsored desilting of one lake around 20 acres. After rains, it was flooded with water. We could see some snakes, frogs, and everything. The general manager of that company was very much inspired and happy. She called that all villagers and said some 30 or 54 houses were there. She announced it there itself. I'll take up a rainwater harvesting facility in each household. It is set to take up. She has promised.
Wonderful.
Thing is, if we involve the public, local aids, if we create an awareness, anything can be achieved. Only problem is there should be transparent in your thinking and views.
Right.
I have received, sir, good thing is I have received donations. All this, whatever we said, 29 lakes plus 5 Kalyanis, what we did, it was out of public money, no government money. I have received funds starting from 6 rupees to 80 lakhs.
Wonderful. Pepsi
Cola India Holdings, they did 3 lakes in Nelmangla Taluk, spending 80 lakhs. Even ITC, they have done 1 lake, spending some 30 lakhs. I have received from 6 rupees to 80 lakhs.
Wonderful. Wonderful to hear.
One day I was going in Dodbalapura town, 3 auto drivers, they gave 100 rupees each. They thought if DC is going there, you will come for money for lakes desilting. That was the impression created there.
Right.
In Kannada, lake means Kere. My name is Karigowda. They used to call me Kere Gowda, Lake Gowda. That was the name earned from the villagers there.
Wonderful.
Even we took up removal of eucalyptus. In Bangalore rural district, eucalyptus is there in 84,000 hectares.
Right.
We do crop survey using mobile app. During last 4 months of tenure there, I tried to remove this because it caused environmental hazard. We were successful with the support of public farmers also. We were successful in removing eucalyptus plantation in 10,000 hectares. It was a good success.
That's wonderful to hear, Mr. Karigowda. So let me I'll come back to you. Yeah, I'll just come back
Yes,
to you.
sir.
We'll just have another round. So it's very interesting. Matthew had also put up the slide on community participation as a key important parameter to get and restore and maintain wetlands which are restored. And you strongly highlighted on the community participation, also looking at the overall landscape in which the wetland is placed, like for example, the eucalyptus plantations, and then try and see what can be done with wetlands. So Mia, your views on wetlands. You've been so involved with urban wetlands, you've been following it up, you've been chasing down causes, writing about it, communicating about it. What's your views on urban wetlands in India, and also on the presentation that Matthew had made?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. WWF has been a part of my growing up, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. First of all, to answer the question, we need to understand what a wetland is and whether the Indian wetland rules correspond with the Ramsar definition of a wetland. So because we have a new wetland rules of 2017, there are a few ways in which significantly we are different from the Ramsar definition. The first is that we've taken out salt pans and we've taken out any artificial creation of a wetland as a wetland. So if we are looking to understand and protect a wetland as a wetland, it needs to fall within the definition of the wetland rules of 2017. So there are 6 people here. We could all have different views of what a wetland really is. To a biologist such as myself, it would be a place which gets migratory birds. To you, perhaps it would be a place that catches rain. To somebody else, to an administrator, it would be something that reflects in land record. As Manju Pandey ma'am also said, you know, a lot of wetlands were classified as wastelands. So there are 2 questions here. The first is, how do we reconcile the wetlands that do not get covered under the Act? For example, paddy fields. Cole Vembanad Ramsar site is actually a big wetland, but it's also one giant paddy field. Then there's also the upper Ganga river stretch, which is not covered under the wetland rules because the wetland rules do not cover flowing water. They do not cover river stretches. Now, this is a Ramsar site, upper Ganga, but it is not a wetland as per the wetland rules. The second thing is that Ramsar usually covers these huge, remarkable wetlands, you know, like a Loktak in Manipur. But a lot of wetlands, particularly in urban areas, are not huge, remarkable sites. They are very small places which may seasonally not be containing any water. And this is something that becomes a big challenge for anybody who's involved to convince the authorities or to convince, you know, even any other stakeholder that this is actually a wetland. And, you know, particularly important in urban drainage context. And, you know, we only remember wetlands when it floods or when we don't have water, right? So the challenge really now is, how do we identify wetlands that fall outside the wetland rules, and how do we come together to protect, if we have to be outside the wetland rules, for example, how do we come together to protect it informally? Because it's also true that not everything requires to be protected under law. We have forests or community sacred areas which may not be sanctuaries, for example, if I were to take a different example. Generally speaking, the wetland committees, the wetland authorities of states have not been very active. It's been several years since the 2010 wetland rules. They were still not notified, the state level authorities, and even now, not all of them have been notified. We need to have more of these conversations in which the wetland authorities should be taking inputs from bird watchers, from fishermen. We all need to be sitting across the table, because a wetland is a really unique ecosystem which really has everybody interested in it in one way or the other. So you have aquaculture, you have flowers being grown, you have fishing, you have recreation, you have tourism. In many ways, the stakeholders are more visible than they would be for, say, a forest or even a sea. So in the urban context as well, if I were to take the example of Najafgarh wetland of Delhi, which is basically the Sahibi River of Yor, which is now known as Najafgarh Drain, unfortunately. Now that's a place where people are growing flowers. That's a place which where people want to do commercial fishery, but it's also a place for bird watchers and ornithologists such as myself. We go there to count birds in winter. And as you said, you yourself said, biodiversity is also an important component, right? So the birds that come down from Mongolia, from Tibet, and from Central Asia stop in Najafgarh. before they go down towards South India. So Delhi becomes an important stop. The wetlands of Delhi, Okhla and Najafgarh become important. So I think let's look at how we can conserve wetlands, as Mr. Gowda said. There could be many wetlands that could be for rainwater harvesting. They may not fall in the wetland rules of the state. They may not be notified by the state as wetlands. They may not be Ramsar sites ever. But let's also recognize that such wetlands do exist. It is also important to recognize them, maybe unofficially. And any template we create for protecting wetlands is a useful one, because it is not always that you will have a formal notification. Even within the formal notification, it's important for more conversation to happen because the stakes are too high. Koleru is a Ramsar site. It's not exactly a urban wetland, but it's a huge Ramsar site which is almost completely taken over by aquaculture. The new wetland rules say that aquaculture is not a wetland. So we'll have many more wetlands which will get taken over by aquaculture, and then they will not be recognized as wetlands, and we need to guard against that as well.
Right. Thank you, Neha. I think you're highlighting very nice points here, which I'm sure that Dr. Matthew Simpson will also consider as part sort of something unique about non-wetlands, and how does it get captured in the public imagination, and that there be efforts to preserve and protect it outside the sphere of the legal frameworks and legal structures also. How is it to be ingrained in public discourse and narratives so that there's more valuation of biodiversity and more understanding of biodiversity? As you pointed out, Neha, in my city also, in Bangalore also, the first effort to protect wetlands came from the bird watchers, who on their own did a survey of the 262 tanks and lakes, and from a bird watcher's perspective brought it to the notice of the city authorities as to how crucial these wetlands were. So to involve many more stakeholders in it. And the last point about the livelihoods versus wetlands conflict, which can also arise and which needs to be managed and understood in a more sensitive fashion. So these are very important points that come up. So I'll bring you in later into the discussion with the Q&A, but I'll ask Professor K.T. Ravindran now. Professor, you talked more about the broader coastal wetlands, the mangroves and other larger scale issues. How do you see wetlands being integrated in the Town and Country Planning Acts and in the master plans and land uses? Do you see any traction there? Is there any sensitivity and understanding of urban wetlands and the networks that connect them and protection under these master plans? Professor, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I'll repeat. At present, there really is no link between the issues and the concerns for wetlands and the issues of urban planning. That link does not exist. Yeah? In most master plans which are prepared, there is not even an area which is identified as environmentally sensitive area or wetland, or any such uses are not mentioned. They're just simply shown blank white. Sometimes they are called developable land. In the case of Delhi master plan earlier, that used to be the criteria. So the entire riverbed zone was actually shown as a developable land, but not assigning any specific land use. That means it's open for any kind of exploitation. So this is the unfortunate state. So there is a number of steps that we need to take to ensure that this connect is maintained. And I see WWF as being a key organization which can probably play that role of getting into a bit of research about what there is already existing as laws and regulations, various authorities which have been created in different states who may be inactive, but they do exist, their structure, as well as looking at how the regulations which are brought out from the perspective of the wetlands are then translated into urban planning strategies.
Right.
This link does not exist at present. For instance, ISRO has come out with quite a detailed map of where the wetlands are. And ISRO has also come out with a 5-meter contour maps called the Bhuvan maps, which are freely available on the net. Any organization, any authority can take them and map these locations and their land profiles and can ensure that they are included in their master plan. This is very easily possible. Now, the big floods that we saw in Chennai a few years ago was the real reason was the invasion of the water bodies and the wetlands and the non-declared wetlands, so the paddy fields in the northwest of Chennai, which were actually the area from where the waters from the eastern Ghats were flowing down into the estuaries in the Madras city, Chennai city. The three rivers in Chennai city were the estuaries. Traditionally also, if you look at the growth of Indian metropolitan cities, whether Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, or of course Delhi not, or even other port cities like Cochin and Bhubaneswar and so on, they have all developed along estuaries of rivers.
Right.
And these estuaries are also the place where the velocity of the water flow reduces and the water meanders and creates large areas of wetlands and then flows back and it gently flows into the sea.
Right.
These areas can be very easily mapped. They're not mapped at all. It's one of the reasons why the Madras city flood experienced such horrible floods, where 2 floors of buildings were even inundated in the heart of the city because all the wetlands were taken over by new development.
Right.
And unplanned.
Right.
Many of them planned because the government itself, the PWD of the Chennai PWD, built thousands and thousands of homes along the Adyar River basin,
Right.
which was actually the original wetlands of around the Adyar River, and they were all completely taken over. And that's one of the reasons the water could not escape anywhere, and all these houses went underwater.
Right. So
Big
there's a
developers
lot.
have developed whole cities in that wetland.
So a lot needs to be done to integrate town planning and urban wetlands, obviously. Ironically, in a strange sense, the ISRO head office on New BL Road in Bangalore is actually located in a tank bed, is in a wetland. As you map with Bhuvan, 5-meter resolutions, you yourself are in a wetland. These are the strange ironies of land use and land use planning. Mr. Keregowda, as I would call you, I'll bring you in. You have this nice concept that you developed of what you call a wetland district, right? Now, if these kind of imaginations have to be captured of an entire district paying attention to wetlands, what do you think is necessary for us to push those ideas within the imaginations of the people, but also in the governance structures? Mr. Keregowda, not Keregowda, Mr. Keregowda.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you have to involve the youth.
Right.
That's the only thing I followed in Bangalore Rural District. If you involve the youth, it is easy to convince them because they have the grasping capacity to understand the importance. If we make them to understand the importance of wetlands and water, it is easy for any administrator or any NGO to achieve the desired results, sir.
Right. So involve youth. That's a very strong message. It's a very nice message. But also these imaginations of bureaucrats putting forward things like a wetland district. No? That's a nice terminology to hear. And then there's some pride that the district itself will take when it works around restoring those water bodies and wetlands.
Sir, basically Bangalore Rural District is Arkavati Basin district, sir. Earlier 25 or 30 years back, people used to grow paddy in each village. Even if you go and speak to any senior citizens, they will recall their stories of prosperity and greenery. Now everything is gone. Right. So you have to educate, create an awareness in youth. Right. If that happens, definitely intervention from government may be minimal, sir. As I mentioned earlier, whatever we have done, we have not used a single penny from government exchequer. Only public, you have to create awareness. That's the only thing I have understood, sir, as DC do in Bangalore Rural District.
Wonderful, wonderful message. So I'll bring you in, Neha, on this particular one. Now, what do you think is the communication exercise necessary to involve more people in urban wetlands, especially urban wetlands, and in getting more volunteers, more people, more advocacy groups to come forward? Neha, your thoughts on it?
I think we should first recognize that wetlands are seen as land by most cities, whether it's the town planners, whether it's any planning, even in Delhi, Dwarka is on Najafgarh wetland and in the Najafgarh catchment, and parts of Gurgaon as well across the border in Haryana. Basically, the floods are made in the catchment of the Sahibi River and Najafgarh Jheel. So some of the places are actually underwater during the monsoon, the basements especially. So the only way then to ensure that this doesn't happen is, as Mr. Gowda said, to involve the citizens, and definitely the young citizens are a good target group. You know, we've had a lot of movements recently for urban trees. So whether it's RA in Bombay, which has not fully succeeded, but has been going on for years now. There was also a movement in Delhi to save trees in the government colonies of Sarojini Nagar and Naroji Nagar. That is people coming from all walks of life, not people like you and me who are interested in environment, but people who are just citizens of that place, who feel that, you know, the place where they live, you know, requires some input from them, that all the decisions shouldn't be made for them. So I think that cities require open spaces, and wetlands and forests are the two kinds of open spaces you can have. So we definitely need to also, while we're doing biodiversity conservation, it's also important to develop these sites where people can go and walk and experience it. You know, there are many examples from throughout the world where, you know, cities get too polluted and people go back to nature. In fact, even the COVID pandemic has a lot of people talking once again about nature being so important, because, you know, people are able to appreciate nature more, people are able to see wild animals more and bluer skies because of less pollution. So we need to develop certain pilot wetlands as recreational spots. We need to develop this with biodiversity in mind, as well as places that people can access. The whole of the Yamuna, for example, should be one giant biodiversity park, which has native grasses and reeds and riparian ecosystems, but also places where people can interact with the river, meaning walkways and all of that. So it is not a jungle in the sense of being impenetrable,
Right.
because then it sells itself, right? And then people realize the nature deficit you tend to have in a city can be addressed through wetlands, and some wetlands are big and some are small. So the ones that are small particularly can be a very good way of getting people involved. So we need more people like Mr. Gowda. A lot of wetlands in India have actually been saved just through personal and individual interest of individual officers or individual groups working in certain places. So I would say develop pilot areas which work both for biodiversity and recreation. It should not be one versus the other.
Right. Right.
And that is how you are able to market this idea, because then people become the stakeholders.
Wonderful.
And then it's difficult to, you know, take it over for flats or whatever else.
Right. So it's nice that you're talking about sort of wetland literacy parks or wetland literacy zones where more people are exposed to the idea of wetlands, what they can contribute, biodiversity, and showcase it and build knowledge, especially of young people and school children too, as we go along. That's wonderful. Matthew, you've been listening to all the panelists. You made your presentation. What are the kind of ideas you're getting about India, and how should India start to approach, based on your international experience, urban wetlands?
Thank you. Fantastic comments and really interesting. And I must just say that the experience that you have in India is typical of many, many countries around the world. It's a very similar approach. Some themes that were coming out in the discussion there that I think are really important. One was the white areas on maps as developable land. You know, that is a huge problem, and it really has to be education, I think, of planners, of policymakers, to show what important ecosystem services those areas are delivering. You know, biodiversity is key, recreation, tourism is key, but also the role in terms of stormwater storage, in terms of water quality, all the ecosystem services. So that has to completely change. And that's what we managed to do in Colombo. Those areas which were kind of seen as places that could just be developed suddenly were put as part of the flood storage approach. And I think another key theme that's coming out is scale, because if you're looking at it from, say, a sponge city perspective, so you're thinking about water storage, even a few square meters of wetland helps contribute to reducing flooding downstream. And having thousands of these little small areas, we call them, in the UK, we call them pocket parks, where they are literally might be 10 square meters outside someone's house, but that can really contribute to reducing rainfall runoff downstream. And I think Ms. Sinha's comments about, the Ramsar, often the Ramsar Convention wetlands, wetlands of international importance are huge wetlands, but the actual convention is meant to be wise use of all wetlands. And people tend to forget that. And that's even really, really small wetlands. And I think if, national regulations reflect that and identify all of these wetlands, it's very important. So I think, when we're talking about planning, it has to be a very holistic approach, because it should be looking at biodiversity as part of city planning. It should certainly be looking at drainage. And, planning does do drainage, but it normally does it just around one development and not thinking about flood routing throughout a whole city. And if you start thinking about flood routing throughout a whole city, then you incorporate all these small wetlands within it, and they become important suddenly when perhaps they weren't important before. Just to echo some other points that were made, which I think are really crucial, is that kind of involving the local community is key. We found that wetlands that are built outside someone's house, if there is no sort of ownership or empowerment for the local people, they just get left and not looked after. But if the community are part of that, then they will insist that there is good management from local government, and they will even take the management on themselves if, rubbish is being thrown into them and they get polluted. So that connection with local community. And something that happened in Colombo, which I think is really interesting, is the wetlands, I think culturally, they'd been sort of came into the conscious that they were negative areas. And so as a result, people built houses without windows looking across the wetland area, but windows looked out onto the road, and most of it was facing onto the road. Now, creating safe areas for people to access these wetlands so that they can enjoy the biodiversity, they can walk through nice, safe trails, and there are staff in some areas, in some of the wetland parks, suddenly the city is turning round, and new developments have windows looking out across the wetlands. So suddenly they're valued, and then the house price of that house is higher because it's overlooking a nice natural wetland area. So I think you can change the culture within a city and then change the economic value within the city. And you can certainly change the health of the population because they're able to access these green areas. And then if you're thinking on macro terms, if you've got a healthier population, it's more productive, so the economy does better. If you've got wetlands that are storing stormwater, then flooding damage is less, so the economy of that city's getting better. And these are the arguments I think we need to talk to planners about, because if you're saying that the economy is going to thrive because you're going to have a healthier, more motivated, happier workforce, if you like, across the city, and you're reducing the impacts of storms and even climate change in the future, then that becomes economic sense for the city.
Absolutely. And that's a very interesting point and a very interesting note. The recent studies about how when people spend some time in these areas, their stress levels come down, they're mentally more happy. And those are newer studies which are emerging, which really talks about a livable city and a healthy city being fostered by wetlands, right? Which is the point that you're making.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Manju Pandeyji, you've been listening to all the panelists and you've listened also in, and you're the key driver for wetlands here. What do you think will be needed for the government of India and for you particularly to make this actually a national movement so that more citizens, more community groups start to get involved and we see a vibrant, resilient urban wetlands all across our nation? What are your thoughts on it?
Okay, before I answer that, I need to clarify on the point which Neha had made about wetlands. That is, this is the kind of wrong interpretation which had happened, which led to, delay in the formation of wetland authorities. What she said was that in the new 2017 rules, we have left the definition of Ramsar for wetlands, and we have kind of made a new definition for ourselves. Let me clarify, that is not so. The Ramsar definition is the same definition which has been kept in the wetland rules also. The only difference which has been made is we have kept the human-made wetlands out of the wetland rules. Now that was done for a specific purpose. because the human-made wetlands like salt pans or aquaculture or whatever, they are made for a specific purpose. The moment the rules apply to them, there are a lot of do's and don'ts which start applying to them. So therefore, all the state wetland authorities, the first task which was given to them was preparation of an inventory of the wetlands in their states. Now we have a national wetland atlas with us, which has mapped wetlands up to 2.25 hectares. So that atlas is to be used by the state wetland authorities with the ground truthing. They're supposed to prepare an inventory of all the wetlands, which include the human-made wetlands. Now, the confusion is the rules will not apply to the human-made wetland, but that doesn't mean that those wetlands are not wetlands anymore. See, what the kind of query which we keep having is, Government of India has said that these are not wetlands anymore. No, we haven't said that. They remain wetlands. They will be part of your inventory. It is just that the wetland rules will not apply to them. And there are many wetlands, which have been kept out because they are already getting covered by some other rule. Like all the coastal wetlands are getting covered under the coastal regulation zone rules. So therefore, there's no point having the same area, two kind of rules applying to it. So if it is already getting protected by a particular rule, it will be protected. Now that was just for clarification. Now, what you asked me, what are we going to do? Now, I know when you look at it, you feel not enough is being done, but I always like to be optimistic. There are a lot of stories coming in from Delhi. Just see, she's been talking about Najafgarh. Yes, there were a lot of problems, but there is a time somebody has to take a call. Now, look at Delhi. You would have heard the Rajokri revival story. The entire wetland, a constructed wetland has been made. It is kind of purifying the water there. And, the entire thing has been revived. Delhi has taken up a project of reviving 160 water bodies. And Delhi Jal Board is working diligently on it. They even have project of creating lakes. Like one of the panelists was saying, two kinds. One is protection of the wetlands and one is creation of wetlands. So Delhi is going ahead with both. And in the new master plan for the NCR, which is being made, yes, earlier master plans, probably wetlands were not classified really there. But the new NCR master plan, which is being made, we had gone and given a presentation there on wetlands. Wetlands are being put into that. So therefore, if there is political will, if work has to be done, it can be done. And there are many cities which are doing it. Now, for the wetland accreditation, unfortunately, we missed the deadline. We couldn't send it to Ramsar because of the lockdown, which happened, immediately in March. We were working towards that. Kollam city, we had already, spoken to the mayor there for the Wetland City accredited. They have two Ramsar sites, Sastamkota and Ashtamudi. So, but it involves a lot of paperwork and we couldn't complete all that. East Kolkata wetlands now, yes, earlier what has happened, the Salt Lake, but now it is getting protected. So, I feel that now this thing has come that wetlands you don't need to explain to people that if you don't protect wetlands, you will have floods. We are seeing floods every day. The entire country is flooded. This is the time. Therefore, the Ministry of Jal Shakti, which has gone ahead last year, with a program where through an entire country, officers were sent to see that rainwater harvesting, the earlier structures which were made are rejuvenated, all the ponds are cleared. So it has come. I think in the next 1 or 2 years, you will see a significant change. And I would like to, end on that positive note, because yes, there is a lot of problem. We as administrators get to see problems more because, while implementing, you get to see that there are so many problems. But then, it's better to look at the positive stories. And there are a lot of people who are working on that. From Noida, Dadri, we keep on getting people, local people like Mr. Keregoda was telling us. We have in fact, we have tried to, in our 4-pronged strategy, we have already put a thing called Wetland Mitras, Friends of Wetlands. There are people working there. We have tried to kind of formalize the system. See to it, that we have volunteers for each and every wetland we are working on. And obviously, people who know about wetlands will, they keep on telling you also about if there is an encroachment, they'll look to it that, that it doesn't happen. So, I mean, those are the kind of things which is a must. And for me, my recommendation is you have to identify a wetland as a wetland. Wetland has to come into the revenue record as a wetland, so that nobody treats it as a wasteland and has a free hand for encroaching it. Therefore, as per the rules, we were supposed to notify it also. We are lagging behind in that. The notification work is lagging behind. I mean, it has to start so that all wetlands are notified as wetlands.
Thank you, Manju Pandey. It's not to bring you defensive or anything, but
perhaps, no, it's not defensive. Because there was a lot of confusion about this. That is why we have come up with the guidelines to the wetland rules. Perfect. So that there is no confusion.
Perfect.
I think because of the word or something, there was a lot of confusion about why these wetlands are out of it. They are not out of it. That's what I'm trying to clarify, so that you don't go back seeing that, it is not there. Wetlands have been taken out of the wetland rules. It's not like that.
So, I'm sure that there will be some one article coming from it with an interview with Manju Pandey and a clarification from both sides as to what exactly is the issue at debate. I'll just sort of
wanted to say that what ma'am is saying about wetlands appearing in revenue record as wetlands is the kind of attitude we need to have. The only thing I was making is that salt pans and aquaculture actually exist in certain wetlands, which will now no longer be covered. And on the coastline, we are seeing many wetlands getting encroached. And therefore, that is a huge, concern for migratory birds. And India has actually launched a national action plan for the Central Asian flyways, which is going to conserve some of these wetlands.
Yeah.
Maybe, as I was suggesting, we need to look outside the wetland rules to be able to actually conserve these important spaces.
Right. So as usual with an interesting panel and interesting points of discussion, we always run into this time challenge. So I just want to take one or two questions from the audience. There have been quite a lot of questions that have come in, and I want to at least pick one or two. This is for anybody in the panel who wants to pick up, but perhaps Manju Pandey can also start to answer this. Land prices and urban real estate prices drive a lot of pressure, put a lot of pressure on the commons, which the urban wetlands are. How is that to be handled in a realistic fashion, given exploding cities and exploding land prices? Manju Pandey.
As I said, if you notify the wetlands, put them in the land records, and whatever the price is, if it is a wetland in the land record, it cannot be encroached upon. If it is notified, there is a legal protection to it then. So therefore, very important that we get them notified.
Right. So who would do that identification? Would it be the revenue department which would do it in the revenue maps?
It is, the state wetland authorities should take it up now.
Right.
See, you have the wetland atlas.
Right.
You can do the ground truthing. Talk to the revenue department and see that they are put. As I said, UP has started putting them under the land records.
Right.
So what is left now is notifying. So the process has started. But then again, because it's land revenue, etc., everything is a state subject. It's very difficult for us to kind of, ask all the states to do it because each state has a different way of handling these things.
Right.
Sir, to add what Manju Pandey madam has said, it's there in all our nalas, wetlands. It's there in our cadastral maps and land records. Compare the maintenance of land records in Karnataka is comparatively better because we digitized our RTC way back in 2000 itself. Even if we maintain these wetlands as per the cadastral maps, even in urban area also we can maintain them without any problems.
Right.
The need of the hour is we need to establish a database, sir, and to mapping of wetlands in urban area. That's all. In addition to these cadastral maps and revenue records.
Right. So I have a question for Neha. Are we destroying wetlands in the name of beautification with our interventions in some places? Is that also happening? That's a very interesting question, Neha.
It's happened in some places and it's happened in the proper way in other places. So we can't generalize. But, it depends on what the outcome, development of wetland is perhaps an oxymoron. You don't really need to develop it in the
Right.
sense it's not a building to be built. But in certain places, in Delhi, for example, we have the beautiful Yamuna Biodiversity Park, which has created a wetland, which wasn't there earlier, and it's very well done. But in certain places, you have concretization, and as you yourself mentioned, in some places you have only the wetland but not the catchment area, or the source of water gets cut off. So, I mean, both things happen. As I said, we need to focus on both biodiversity and making the place accessible to people.
Right.
People also need to be able to walk and.
I just make a
Yeah.
comment. Yeah. May I make a comment?
Yes, Professor Katie.
For instance, this beautiful biodiversity park in Delhi is just 200 hectares of land, was created as an apology to all the intervention that happened in the rest of the Yamuna River bed. In fact, when a certain department in a university came up with a criticism of the development, the same head of department was given the job to do that biodiversity park. Yeah. Similarly, the biodiversity park in the ridge was also done when criticism about the developments on the ridge was mounting. So these are like small schemes which actually kind of are icing on the cake, and they are not real issues. This is one thing. The second thing is that if you take the Manju madam took the example of Dadri. Dadri has a master plan, and that master plan proposes its industrial area in the wetland area. Its industrial development is shown in the wetland area. Right now, that's the reality now. Now, it's not enough if we have the rule. We need to make the link between implementation and the rule. And that link needs to be created right now in India. It does not exist between the urban planning process and the wetland issues.
Right.
The link needs to be created.
Absolutely.
I can give you any number of examples around Delhi, in the NCR. A watershed management plan was made in the NCR 15 years ago. I attended that meeting at that time, but it's just not been accepted by any of the development bodies within the NCR area, and they're all making their own plans, which has nothing to do with the NCR plan.
So that, yeah.
There are these issues which needs to be addressed if we want to pragmatically and practically resolve issues of this urban invasion on wetlands.
Absolutely. Dr. Matthew Simpson, you had a point to make. Thanks, Dr. Katie.
Just very quickly, I think it's really important that the coordinating urban planning plus wetland protection and bringing it together. And one way that we attempted to do this in Colombo was really work with the decision makers. So, and really make them understand the importance of wetlands and the role it was playing, particularly economically for the city. And it was amazing what traction we then got in the offices when we were talking with people, because suddenly these white areas on the map were turning green or turning blue, and they had a function. And that was because the senior decision makers understood the importance of wetlands. So I think it's getting the regulations aligned, but it's also an education process for decision makers, because otherwise, you know, you can understand why they go, oh, there's a good space to put our new shopping area or our new whatever. And also they might go, well, look, that's just an overgrown area. Let's turn it into a beautiful lake where we can have boats on it for people to, you know, play on. But if they understand what roles it's playing, then they won't make those decisions. So I think that education side for decision makers is very important.
I think that's a very important point that you make, Dr. Matthew. So I'll just ask Professor Katie Ravindran, is there one point that you think that we need focus on as we go forward in our path? One point which you think is of great importance?
I think the most important point is that there should be one agency, one think tank outside the governmental regulatory system, like I said, WWF could be playing that role, should have a research setup in which all the information available is collated into one single place. That's number one stage. And the second stage is the dissemination of that information into not just to one group or the other group, starting from the decision makers, the IAS officers who are trained in Mussoorie or anywhere else, from that location to down to the fisherman who is actually benefiting from the wetland.
Right.
All of them, the entire range at different levels need to be conscientized and educated on the issues of the wetland. And this has to be not just an ad hoc plan, but a concerted effort, a structured effort to disseminate this information at different levels. Because all those levels matter.
Right.
Including the planners and the educators of planners, the schools of planning and architecture and so on. There are no classes on all this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nothing in our schools. And
We need to put that into the place, provided we have cogent body of knowledge, which can then be disseminated. It should be a growing system of knowledge, not just a static thing. But it's required. That's one thing I would say is the most critical thing now.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Neha, would you like to focus on one particular thing? If you had a wish, there are many complex issues also, but one particular thing that would be a favorite of yours to push?
I think we need more biodiversity parks in cities which focus on the native biodiversity. There's a sense of pride that can come, because I think pride is an important one. So like we gave the example of Yamuna Biodiversity Park. Similarly for Bombay, you could have mud flats and coastal wetlands. You have Shivri, for example, in Bombay, which is a place which gets so many flamingos every year. So I think biodiversity park would be something that would be relevant to grasslands, to wetlands, to other ecosystems. And if we do 1,000 biodiversity parks in India, particularly focusing on the cities, that would be a very good way to take this conversation forward.
Thank you, Neha.
The only way to take it forward is to increase the constituency of people interested in preserving that place as a wetland rather than as any other part of land.
Perfect. Very important. Karigowda sir, would you like to say, is there any one point that you want to focus on if you are here? If I can't see Mr. Karigowda.
To make any project successful or any work successful, you have to involve all the stakeholders, sir. As we did in Bengaluru Rural District, you have to involve district administration, survey, local panchayat, NGO, industries association. In any project, whether it's a rural, urban, or a wetland, or any project, you have to involve both government and non-government stakeholders to make it successful, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Manju Madam, Manju Pandeyji, we're all with you. I mean, as a group, we're as equally concerned as you are. So what would you think, what would you look forward to as assistance from the various stakeholders that are around the country to push the agenda of saving wetlands forward? Your thoughts.
I would love it. I would love it if it becomes a kind of people's movement, right? Like you had Chipko in Uttarakhand. Something like, if it becomes a movement across the country, it'll be a major help, because no amount of rules, especially in a federal where the state, water is a state subject, it's very difficult to drive it from here. It has to come from down below. And I think with now the Ministry of Jal Shakti coming in and people realizing the importance of, forget biodiversity. If you have healthy wetlands, if you can tell people that it is required for getting fresh water, it'll stop your flooding. If wetlands are healthy, the birds will automatically come. You don't have to call them, it's there for them. So for me, I'll be very happy, if I can see a people's movement coming for protection of these wetlands.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you for those.
And I'm reading in the comment section, somebody has written, why is Manjuji angry? I was not angry. I was just trying to explain. Maybe because I was a teacher, because before becoming an administrator, maybe the tone, but I was basically trying to explain the wrong interpretation.
Absolutely. So, but there's an anger which has to be directed at the forces which are not helping us protect urban wetlands, not amongst ourselves, for sure. Mr. Karigowda, you had raised your finger. Is there a point that you wanted to make? No. So it's been a very lively discussion, and I can see from the chat box there are many comments that are coming, and the panelists have addressed more or less most of the points that have come in from the chats that are coming. Some of the question and answers have not been possible to answer, but I'm sure that we'll take it up further. It's been a very interesting and vibrant discussion. There's been much knowledge sharing and much empathy amongst all the panelists. I don't want to sum up everything. It's there for people to view and observe as things go along. On behalf of WWF and on behalf of all the audience, I would like to give a big thanks to the keynote speaker and all the panelists for sharing your valuable time and all your experience in this very important cause for India, the protection of wetlands. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
So
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neha.
Thank you.